The COVID-19 pandemic was one of the most divisive times in recent American history, and for many, those wounds have yet to heal some 6 years on. They were on full display as Dr. Anthony Fauci, the face of the United States pandemic response, faced questions from some of the biggest critics of the government's pandemic policies by invoking his constitutional right to silence.
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution. I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Let's try something. What day of the week is it today?
I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Given that you have a unlimited presidential pardon, what is your specific objection that you are making?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Now, Dr. Fauci invoked the Fifth Amendment over 100 times to avoid answering congressional questions. During the pandemic, he faced death threats over the restrictions he championed, like lockdowns, mask mandates, and social distancing, as well as vaccines. He later clashed with Donald Trump over the government's response to the pandemic. And years later, that fight is still playing out. U.S. Senator Rand Paul, in particular, has been pursuing Fauci for years, accusing him of lying about the origin of COVID-19. He subpoenaed him to force this appearance in Washington. Now, Democrats have called the hearing politically motivated, with one committee member saying it aims to, quote, basically legitimize a predetermined conclusion that was reached years ago. For his part, Rand Paul says he wants to see Fauci behind bars. Now, over the weekend, Senator Paul also published a tranche of Fauci's journal entries, which were prepared for the public by Senator Paul himself and published without Dr. Fauci's permission. They reveal his uncertainty in the pandemic's earliest days as scientists around the world race to understand the new virus. I'm now joined by Timothy Hagle, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Iowa. Timothy, thanks a lot for joining us.
Good to be with you.
So how exactly would you assess what happened on Capitol Hill? What's driven us to these hearings more than 6 years after the pandemic began?
It's probably a combination of things. Some of it, of course, is political, but a lot of it has to do with, at least in the, I suppose, in the mind of Senator Paul, of trying to get at the truth and find out, well, what was going on and make people responsible, pay the price for the lying that was occurring. Now, lying may be a little bit strong, but that's certainly Senator Paul's point of view. But it seems that there were a lot of decisions that were made that were not justified at the time. And basically, this is a little payback.
Now, some of the Democrats seem to indicate that Fauci is more of a symbol rather than an individual. However, you seem to think that the investigations or these hearings are legitimate. Which side do you come down on?
Well, it's always a kind of a combination of things that you sort of say, as we saw today, a lot of this was what we could consider political theater. Certainly, we didn't get any answers, but there was a show going on, and that happens. Doesn't matter which party's in control. We see a lot of that these days, unfortunately. But on the other hand, people are still unhappy. A lot of people, at least on the Republican side in particular, unhappy about some of the lockdowns and other things that occurred during COVID, and basically want to hold people responsible that they feel were taking inappropriate steps during that period.
Okay, I want to read part of an open letter signed by a number of scientists and public health advocates ahead of this hearing. Now, they said that the administration and its allies in Congress are waging an ongoing war against individual scientists through public harassment, arrests, criminal indictment, and ongoing threats of prosecution. Now, those are strong charges. Do you think it actually describes what's happening, or does it overstate the case?
It probably overstates the case a little bit, but one of the things that we saw now, at least in hindsight, was that perhaps the public and public officials rely too heavily on science. The science isn't an exact science, so to speak, that a lot of times people are making guesses and not making correct decisions. Now, a lot of times those conclusions are in hindsight, that maybe at the time when things were going on, we didn't know how bad COVID was, that the extremer measures were probably or seemingly appropriate, but in hindsight, we didn't think so. But again, it's a matter of maybe we're putting too much faith into the scientific method, or maybe the scientific method isn't adhered to as strictly as perhaps it should be. That sometimes you get scientists that are more concerned, for example, with getting grants of one sort or another. So there's some sort of scientific malfeasance of a certain sort. Now, not to criticize all science, I'm engaged in political science. So again, you see people doing good work, but some people maybe not doing as good work or putting too much faith into it in one way or another. And so perhaps we need to come to a better balance. Is that going to happen through the political process? Maybe not. Maybe it will, but it doesn't hurt to some extent to ask some of these questions.
Sure. But for his part, Fauci and the agency he ran say they brought in the measures to prevent even more people from dying during the pandemic. So I guess from an international perspective, it's kind of hard to understand why he won't simply answer the questions put to him by these members of Congress.
Well, that's where you start to get into the legal side of things here, that even though he was given a very large pardon by President Biden, it still opens him up to potential state charges, because the president can only pardon you for any federal crimes that you may have committed, but also any civil matters as well. And certainly there are a lot of people that were very unhappy. You know, maybe their parents were locked away in some elderly healthcare facility and ended up dying there, and they didn't get to say goodbye. And so maybe it was inappropriate. We know different states had more extreme measures. New York was one that was more extreme. Other places in Iowa was fairly, the Republican governor didn't go into lockdown as much as some other places, but still initially said, well, you can't congregate at church. And she rescinded that eventually. But again, that made people unhappy. And so we're seeing a reaction to this, not just in this case of what's going on with Fauci and maybe science in general, but also maybe limiting, like we see here in Iowa, where there's the legislature wanted to limit the government or the governor's powers in an emergency situation, and specifically reference what happened during COVID. So again, the public is getting a say in this through its representatives in terms of making sure, well, if something like this happens again, that it's going to be approached in perhaps a little bit different way.
Okay, now you mentioned the pardon that Joe Biden gave to Fauci before he left office. What does it say about the current political climate in the United States that a former government scientist needs legal protection just to appear before Congress?
Well, I wouldn't say it's so broad that any government scientist has to have protection of that sort to appear before Congress. But we have seen a lot of times when somebody is called before Congress because of perceived wrongdoing, and again, maybe Congress is investigating, trying to find that out. Unfortunately, the political environment is so divisive these days that usually if you are called before Congress, that whatever party is doing the calling is in the majority, Republicans now, but sometimes Democrats, that they're looking to get somebody, make some political hay out of whatever's going on, and maybe there will be criminal charges that will result. Now, in the case of Fauci, there were people, particularly Senator Paul, who thinks that Fauci was criminally negligent or criminally responsible for things that happened, that he overstepped his authority and it was lying basically to not only Congress but other public officials in terms of the advices he was giving. And so because of a lot of the problems that occurred, that basically people want to see somebody held responsible as a result. And so that's the kind of thing. Now, not all scientists or not all officials that appear before Congress have to have that kind of legal protection. But we also know that we're a very litigious society, and that means that you do have to be very careful. If you are saying things in a public sphere, and of course you're under oath when you testify before Congress, you have to be careful to protect yourself, and usually that means having a lawyer, and that also means that you're going to invoke your Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination in many instances.
Now, speaking more broadly, what do you think that the pandemic did for public trust in science in the government? I mean, here in Germany and in Europe, we still see people invoking that time and time again when it comes to mistrust of the government. Is it a similar situation where you are?
It absolutely is. In fact, it's very strong, and that's what we're seeing in many legislatures. Again, here in Iowa, the legislature passed a law that basically, and the governor signed it, basically limiting the governor's powers to invoke the national or state emergency of various sorts, whether it's something like COVID or it could be something else as well, simply because we saw here in Iowa that other states went further than they really needed to. Now, again, hindsight, maybe 2020, that we didn't know at the time how dangerous COVID was, how quickly it would spread, how contagious it was, and so forth. But a lot of the reaction was that it was too much. And then, of course, you get into the whole thing. Well, what was the origin? And people, or Fauci in particular, were saying, oh, it was a wet market kind of a thing, and it was animal come through, as opposed to the Wuhan lab. So, it's a mistrust. And now we're seeing the diary entries of Fauci, which basically seem to suggest that he was saying one thing publicly and to public officials, but another thing privately in his diary, in terms of whether he believed, the origin or how the spread was or whatever it happened to be. And so these kinds of things, again, make people distrust the government, and understandably so in this type of situation, especially if you've had, relatives die, or you've had reactions to the COVID shots and so forth, that you may say, well, I'm not going to trust it anymore. And that's not necessarily a good thing. We want we want to be able to follow the science. We want to be able to believe scientists and so forth, but sometimes they don't know. And if they go beyond what they do know, that it can cause problems.
Now, when it comes to these hearings specifically, there does seem to be kind of a hyper-focus on Fauci as a person. Do you think that's distracting, maybe from some of the more broad questions that should be asked regarding the U.S.'s pandemic response?
It probably does. I would say that's probably true, that you need to look at it. But again, sometimes you have to have that focal point to get information through in a way that then you can go beyond that and tackle whatever the problems are. And so you basically have to start, I suppose, and this would probably be Senator Paul's argument, is that you have to start with the point person on all of this, who was Fauci, because of course he became a national figure, an international figure, as a result of what was going on here. And because of that, because of what happened, and again, sort of to be generous, the miscommunication between what was going on, what he was saying privately and publicly, that you need to say, all right, we need to get this out in the open. We need to understand what was actually going on, and then maybe take it from there. And again, it can come through in terms of legislation at the federal level, at the state level, in terms of how are we going to handle these things if we should run into a situation like this again.
And that's exactly what I wanted to ask you about. How do you think these hearings, or this general mistrust in the health authorities in the United States and the government, how do you think that's going to affect America's ability to respond to the next health crisis if this is how the last one gets remembered?
Yeah, and that it doesn't help in that regard that Fauci, again, to protect himself, and that's perfectly understandable, took the Fifth Amendment, refused to testify. Now, maybe they'll be able to get some of this information out. And if Congress really wants to know what Fauci's feelings were on this, then they can give him additional immunity. Now, again, all they can do is do it through federal law. He's still open perhaps to state laws, if any were applicable, and civil proceedings as well. So it's still going to be difficult for him. But for them to get the information, but at least they being Congress, tried to get some information, but they need at this point perhaps to go elsewhere.
All right, I'm afraid we have to leave it there. That was Dr. Timothy Hagle, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Iowa. Thanks very much for sharing your expertise with us.
You're very welcome.
So what do you think about Fauci's testimony to Congress? Let us know in the comments. And until next time, thanks for watching.